Hello there. How are you? Ooh, my hair is all fluffy. Welcome. Nice to have you along. I'm Chris Voss, and this is the Aurora Bedtime Story Project, where every night we do a little bedtime story, about an hour's worth, and we've been doing some stories from Thornton Burgess's Old Mother Westwind tales, and we're going to continue that tonight. And we're also going to have the next two chapters of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So that's what's in store tonight. Thank you so much for coming along, and I hope you're doing okay and have had a good day. I wanted to show you a little prop I brought along because, I can't see you. You can see me, but I wanted to pretend to be able to see you. So I brought along this tiny little chair. And I'm going to put it right up there by my computer, and then we can pretend that you are watching along, and that you're sitting right there in that chair, and I'll be talking right to you. Okay? All right. There it is. Okay. Hello, hello, hello. So let's start off right away with another couple of chapters from Old Mother Westwind. Now, Old Mother Westwind has all of her children. She keeps them in a big bag, and they're the merry little breezes, and they go around this big field, and they have a lot of adventures with all the wonderful little woodland creatures that are in this green meadow. And today we're going to start with Billy Mink's swimming party. That's what we're going to learn now. So, oh, I almost forgot. We have to take a deep breath. We've been doing this now last few nights, taking a deep breath to relax before we get into some stories. So let's do that right now. I'm going to count to 3, and then we're going to inhale, okay? 1, 2, 3. And exhale. Let's do it again. Inhale. And exhale. Okay. I feel better. Feel a little more relaxed. Here is Billy Mink's swimming story by Thornton Burgess. Billy Mink was coming down the bank of the Laughing Brook. Billy Mink was feeling very good indeed. He had had a good breakfast, the sun was warm, little white cloud ships were sailing across the blue sky, and their shadows were sailing across the green meadows. The birds were singing, and the bees were humming. Billy Mink felt like singing too, but Billy Mink's voice was not meant for singing. By and by, Billy Mink came to the swimming pool. Here, the Laughing Brook stopped and rested on its way to join the big river. It stopped its noisy laughing and singing and just lay, smiling and smiling in the warm sunshine. The little flowers on the bank leaned over and nodded to it. The beech tree, which was very old, sometimes dropped a leaf into it. The cattails kept their feet cool in its edge. Billy Mink jumped out on the big rock and looked down into the smiling pool. Over on a green lily pad, he saw old Grandfather Frog. "Hello, Grandfather Frog," said Billy Mink. "Hello, Billy Mink," said Grandfather Frog. "What mischief are you up to this fine morning?" Just then, Billy Mink saw a little brown head swimming along one edge of the swimming pool. "Hello, Jerry Muskrat," shouted Billy Mink. "Hello yourself, Billy Mink," shouted Jerry Muskrat. "Come in and have a swim. The water's fine." Good, said Billy Mink. We'll have a swimming party. So Billy Mink called all the Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind who were playing with the flowers on the bank and sent them to find Little Joe Otter and invite him to come to the swimming party. Pretty soon back came the Little Breezes, and with them came Little Joe Otter. "Hello, Billy Mink," said Little Joe Otter. "Here I am." "Hello, Little Joe Otter," said Billy Mink. "Come up here on the big rock and see who can dive the deepest into the swimming pool." So Little Joe Otter and Jerry Muskrat climbed up on the big rock side of Billy Mink, and they all stood side by side in their little brown bathing suits, looking down into the swimming pool. "Now, when I count 3, we'll all dive into the Smiling Pool together and see who can dive the deepest." "1," said Billy Mink. "2," said Billy Mink. "3," said Billy Mink. And when he said 3, in they all went head first. My, such a splash as they did make! They upset old Grandfather Frog so that he fell off his lily pad. They frightened Mr. and Mrs. Trout so that they jumped right out of the water. Tiny Tadpole had such a scare that he hid away way down in the mud with only the tip of his funny little nose sticking out. "Drop," said Grandfather Frog, climbing out on his lily pad. "If I wasn't so old, I would show you how to dive." "Come on, Grandfather Frog," cried Billy Mink. "Show us how to dive." And what do you think? Why, old Grandfather Frog actually got so excited that he climbed up on the big rock to show them how to dive. Splash went Grandfather Frog into the Smiling Pool. Splash went Billy Mink right behind him. Splash, splash went Little Joe Otter and Jerry Muskrat right at Billy Mink's heels. "Hurrah!" said Mr. Kingfisher, sitting on a branch of the old beech tree. And then, just to show them that he could dive too, splash he went into the Smiling Pool. Such a noise as they did make! All the little breezes of Old Mother West Wind danced for joy on the bank. Blackjack the Crow and Sammy Jay flew over to see what was going on. "Now let's see who can swim the farthest under water," cried Billy Mink. So they all stood side by side on one edge of the Smiling Pool. "Go!" shouted the Kingfisher, and in they all plunged. Little ripples ran across the Smiling Pool, and then the water became as smooth and smiling as if nothing had gone into it with a plunge. Now old Grandfather Frog began to realize that he wasn't as young as he used to be, and he couldn't swim as fast as the others anyway. He began to get short of breath, so he swam up to the top and stuck just the tip of his nose out to get some more air. Sammy Jay's sharp eyes saw him. "There's Grandfather Frog!" he shouted. So then Grandfather Frog popped his head out and swam over to his green lily pad to rest. Way over beyond the big rock, little bubbles of 3 long rows kept coming up to the top of the Smiling Pool. They showed just where Billy Mink, Little Joe Otter, and Jerry Muskrat were swimming way down out of sight. It was the air from their lungs making the bubbles. Straight across the Smiling Pool went the lines of little bubbles, and then way out on the farther side 2 little heads bobbed out of the water close together. They were Billy Mink and Little Joe Otter. A moment later, Jerry Muskrat bobbed up beside them. You see, they had swum clear across the Smiling Pool, and of course they could swim no farther. So Billy Mink's swimming party was a great success. I think it's a very nice story. It's just about Billy Mink's swimming party. I'd like to have a swimming party. I never could swim very far underwater with my breath, though. I have a hard time holding my breath. Maybe you do too. So the next story is interesting because it has to do with a character named Peter Rabbit. And if you watched the first of these stories, you know we heard some stories about Peter Rabbit from Beatrix Potter. Now, when Thornton Burgess was writing these stories, he actually wrote them for his very young son. And his young son loved the tales of Peter Rabbit. So, when Thornton Burgess started writing about a rabbit, his son insisted that they call that rabbit Peter Rabbit, and that's the way it went. So, this is the tale of Peter Rabbit playing a joke. One morning, when big round Mr. Sun was climbing up in the sky, and old Mother West Wind had sent all her merry little breezes to play in the green meadows, Johnny Chuck started out for a walk. First, he sat up very straight and looked all around to see if Reddy Fox was anywhere about. For you know Reddy Fox, like Chuck, who was very, very fat, grew very, very warm. By and by, he sat down on the end of a log under a big tree to rest. Thump! Something hit Johnny Chuck right on the top of his round little head. It made Johnny Chuck jump. "Hello, Johnny Chuck," said a voice that seemed to come from right out of the sky. Johnny Chuck tipped his head back, way, way back, and looked up. He was just in time to see Happy Jack Squirrel drop a nut. Down it came and hit Johnny Chuck right on the tip of his funny black little nose. "Oh!" said Johnny Chuck, and tumbled right over back off the log. But Johnny Chuck was so round and so roly-poly that it didn't hurt him a bit. "Ha ha ha!" laughed Happy Jack in the tree. "Ha ha ha ha!" laughed Johnny Chuck, picking himself up. Then they both laughed together. It was such a good joke. "What are you laughing at?" asked a voice so close to Johnny Chuck that he rolled over 3 times, he was so surprised. It was Peter Rabbit. "What are you doing in my wood?" asked Peter Rabbit. "I'm taking a walk," said Johnny Chuck. "Oh, good," said Peter Rabbit. "I'll come along too." So Johnny Chuck and Peter Rabbit set out along the lone little path through the wood. Peter Rabbit hopped along with great big jumps, for Peter's legs are long and meant for jumping. But Johnny Chuck couldn't keep up, though he tried very hard, for Johnny's legs are short. Pretty soon Peter Rabbit came back, walking very softly. He whispered in Johnny Chuck's ear. "I've found something," said Peter Rabbit. "What is it?" said Johnny Chuck. "I'll show you," said Peter Rabbit, "but you must be very, very still and not make the least little bit of noise." Johnny Chuck promised to be very, very still, for he wanted very much to see what Peter Rabbit had found. Peter Rabbit tiptoed down the lone little path through the woods, his funny long ears pointing straight up to the sky, and behind him tiptoed Johnny Chuck, wondering and wondering what it could be that Peter Rabbit had found. Pretty soon they came to a nice, mossy green log right across the lone little path. Peter Rabbit stopped and sat up very straight. He looked this way, and he looked that way. Johnny Chuck stopped too, and he sat up very straight, and he looked this way, and he looked that way. but all he could see was the mossy green log across the lone little path. "What is it, Peter Rabbit?" whispered Johnny Chuck. "You can't see it yet," whispered Peter Rabbit. "But first we have to jump over that mossy green log. Now I'll jump first, and then you jump just the way I do, and then you'll see what it is I've found," said Peter Rabbit. So Peter Rabbit jumped first, and because his legs are long and meant for jumping, he jumped way, way over the mossy green log. Then he turned round and sat up to see Johnny Chuck jump over the mossy green log too. Johnny Chuck tried to jump very high and very far, just as he had seen Peter Rabbit jump, but Johnny Chuck's legs are very short and not meant for jumping. Besides, Johnny Chuck was also very, 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 very Peter Rabbit. He stubbed his toes on the top of the mossy green log, and over he tumbled, head first, and landed with a great big thump right on Reddy Fox, who was lying fast asleep on the other side of the mossy green log. Peter Rabbit laughed and laughed until he had to hold his sides. My, how frightened Johnny Chuck was when he saw what he had done. Before he could get on his feet, he had rolled right over behind a little bush, and there he lay, very, very still. Reddy Fox awoke with a grunt when Johnny Chuck fell on him so hard, and the first thing he saw was Peter Rabbit, laughing so hard that he had to hold his sides. Reddy Fox didn't stop to look around. He thought that Peter Rabbit had jumped on him. Up jumped Reddy Fox, and away ran Peter Rabbit. Away went Reddy Fox after Peter Rabbit. Peter dodged behind the trees and jumped over the bushes and ran this way and ran that way, just as hard as ever he could, for Peter Rabbit was very much afraid of Reddy Fox. And Reddy Fox, he followed Peter Rabbit behind the trees and over the bushes, this way and that way, but he couldn't catch Peter Rabbit. Pretty soon Peter Rabbit came to the house of Jimmy Skunk. He knew that Jimmy Skunk was over in the pasture, so he popped right in, and then he was safe, for the door of Jimmy Skunk's house was too small for Reddy Fox to squeeze in. Reddy Fox sat down and waited, but Peter Rabbit didn't come out. By and by, Reddy Fox gave it up and trotted off home, where old Mother Fox was waiting for him. All this time, Johnny Chuck had sat very still, watching Reddy Fox try to catch Peter Rabbit. And when he saw Peter Rabbit pop into the house of Jimmy Skunk and Reddy Fox trot away home, Johnny Chuck stood up, brushed his little coat very clean, and then trotted back up the lone little path through the wood to his own dear little path through the green meadows, where the merry little breezes of old Mother West Wind were still playing, and he was safe in his own snug little house once more. That's the tale of Peter Rabbit and his joke. Almost got him in trouble. Shall we do one more? We met Sammy Jay. I believe he's a blue jay. Sammy Jay in the first story. And he was the one to see old Grandfather Frog pop his head up to get some air, remember? This is chapter 10 of the Old Mother West Wind Tales. Chapter 10, How Sammy Jay Was Found Out. Sammy Jay was very, very busy indeed. When anyone happened that way, Sammy Jay pretended to be doing nothing at all, for Sammy Jay thought himself a very fine gentleman. He was very proud of his handsome blue coat with white trimmings and his high cap, and he would sit on a fence post and make fun of Johnny Chuck working at a new door for his snug little home in the Green Meadows, and of Striped Chipmunk storing up heaps of corn and nuts for the winter. And for most of the time, Sammy Jay was an idle fellow. And when Sammy Jay was busy, he was pretty sure to be doing something that he ought not to do, for idle people always get into mischief. Sammy Jay was in mischief now, and that is why he pretended to be doing nothing when he thought anyone was looking. Old Mother West Wind had come down from her home behind the Purple Hills very early that morning. Indeed, jolly, round, red Mr. Sun had hardly gotten out of bed when she crossed the Green Meadows on her way to help the big ships across the ocean. Old Mother West Wind's eyes were sharp, and she saw Sammy Jay before Sammy Jay saw her. Now what can Sammy Jay be so busy about, and why is he so very, very quiet? Thought old Mother West Wind. He must be up to some mischief. So, when she opened her big bag and turned out all her merry little breezes to play in the Green Meadows, she sent one of them to see what Sammy Jay was doing in the old chestnut tree. The merry little breezes danced along over the treetops just as if he hadn't a thought in the world but to wake up all the little leaves and set them dancing too, and Sammy Jay, watching old Mother West Wind and the other little breezes, didn't see this merry little breeze at all. Pretty soon it danced back to old Mother West Wind and whispered in her ear, "Sammy Jay is stealing nuts from Happy Jack Squirrel that he had hidden in the hollow of the old chestnut tree, and is hiding them for himself in the tumble-down nest that Black Jack the Crow built in the great pine last year." "Aha!" said old Mother West Wind. Then she went on across the Green Meadows. "Good morning, old Mother West Wind," said Sammy Jay as she passed the fence post where he was sitting. "Good morning, Sammy Jay," said old Mother West Wind. "What brings you out so early in the morning?" "I'm out for my health, old Mother West Wind," said Sammy Jay, very politely. "The doctor has ordered me to take a bath in the dew at sunrise every morning." Old Mother West Wind said nothing, but went on her way across the Green Meadows to blow the ships across the sea. When she had passed, Sammy Jay hurried to take the last of Happy Jack's nuts to the old nest in the great pine. Poor Happy Jack! Soon he came dancing along with another nut to put in the hollow of the old chestnut tree. When he peeped in and saw that all his big store of nuts had disappeared, he couldn't believe his own eyes. He put in one paw and felt all around, but not a nut could he feel. Then he climbed in, and sure enough, the hollow was empty. Poor Happy Jack! There were tears in his eyes when he crept out again. He looked all around, but no one was to be seen but handsome Sammy Jay, very busy brushing his beautiful blue coat. "Good morning, Sammy Jay. Have you seen anyone pass this way?" asked Happy Jack. "Someone has stolen a store of nuts from the hollow in the old chestnut tree." Sammy Jay pretended to feel very badly indeed, and in his sweetest voice, for his voice was very sweet in those days, he offered to help Happy Jack try to catch the thief who had stolen the store of nuts from the hollow in the old chestnut tree. Together they went down across the Green Meadows, asking everyone whom they met if they had seen the thief who had stolen Happy Jack's store of nuts from the hollow in the old chestnut tree. All the merry little breezes joined in the search, and soon everyone who lived in the Green Meadows or in the wood knew that someone had stolen all of Happy Jack Squirrel's store of nuts from the hollow in the old chestnut tree. And because everyone liked Happy Jack, everyone felt sorry indeed for him. The next morning, all the Merry Little Breezes of Old Mother West Wind were turned out of the big bag into the Green Meadows very early indeed, for they had a lot of errands to do. All over the Green Meadows they hurried, all through the wood, up and down the Laughing Brook, and all around the Smiling Pool, inviting everyone to meet at the great pine on the hill at 9 o'clock to form a committee of the whole to try to find the thief who stole Happy Jack's nuts from the hollow in the old chestnut tree. And because everyone liked Happy Jack, everyone went to the great pine on the hill. Reddy Fox, Bobby Coon, Jimmy Skunk, Striped Chipmunk, who is Happy Jack's cousin, you know, Billy Mink, Little Joe Otter, Jerry Muskrat, Hooty the Owl, who was almost too sleepy to keep his eyes open, Black Jack the Crow, Johnny Chuck, Peter Rabbit, even old Grandfather Frog. Of course, Sammy Jay was there, looking his handsomest. When they all had gathered round the great pine, Old Mother West Wind pointed to the old nest way up in the top of it. "Is that your nest?" she asked Black Jack the Crow. "It was, but I gave it to my cousin, Sammy Jay," said Black Jack the Crow. "Is that your nest? And may I have a stick out of it?" asked Old Mother West Wind to Sammy Jay. "It is," said Sammy Jay with his politest bow, "and you are welcome to take a stick out of it." To himself he thought, "She will only take one from the top, and that won't matter." Old Mother West Wind suddenly puffed out her cheeks and blew so hard that she blew a big stick right out of the bottom of the old nest. Down it fell, bumpity-bump on the branches of the big great pine tree, and after it fell, what do you think? Why, hickory nuts, and chestnuts, and acorns, and hazelnuts, such a lot of them. Why, cried Happy Jack, "there are all my stolen nuts!" Everyone turned to look at Sammy Jay, but he was flying off through the wood as fast as he could go. "Stop, thief!" cried Old Mother West Wind. "Stop, thief!" cried all the Merry Little Breezes, and Johnny Chuck, and Billy Mink, and all the rest. But Sammy Jay didn't stop. Then all began to pick up the nuts that had fallen from the old nest where Sammy Jay had hidden them. By and by, with Happy Jack leading the way, they all marched back to the old chestnut tree, and there Happy Jack stored all the nuts away in his snug little hollow once more. And ever since that day, Sammy Jay, the Blue Jay, whenever he tries to call, just screams, "Thief! Thief! Thief!" Alright, that is the end of that little story, and the end of the Thornton Burgess Old Mother West Wind Tales for this evening. Hope you're doing okay. Thank you for joining me. If this is your first time watching, I'm Chris Voss, and we do this every night. Live, 8:30, bedtime stories, and you can watch them again whenever you want, at whatever time you want. They're all saved here on the Aurora Bedtime Story Project page. I want to take a moment and welcome you if you are new, and want to let you know, if you have any suggestions for books that you want me to read or stories you'd like me to read, just heard from Hannah who had some suggestions, I'd love to know about it. I'd love to read those stories for you. So let me know. You can leave a comment, or you can send me a message, and I'll see about trying to get some of those books. Okay, so up next, we are going to continue with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. And today, Alice is going to find her way towards a very strange little tea party. And she's also going to find herself playing croquet with the Queen of Hearts. Now, croquet is a game that has a big hammer and a little ball and then these little arches and you stick into the grass. And you try to hit the ball through those arches. But you'll see the Queen of Hearts game of croquet is a little bit different, but we'll get to that. So, shall we take another deep breath? I'm going to take a sip of water from my lefty cup. Here's my lefty cup. My little chair is still, or your little chair, still got it sitting right there, my little prop, so I can pretend that that is where you're sitting. And let's take another deep breath. Inhale. 1. And exhale. That's nice. Okay. Chapter 7 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. A Mad Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. A dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it, talking over its head. Very uncomfortable for the dormouse, thought Alice, only, as it's asleep, I suppose it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at one corner of it. "No room! No room!" they cried out when they saw Alice coming. "There's plenty of room," said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at the end of the table. "Have some wine," the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. "I don't see any wine," she remarked. "There isn't any," said the March Hare. "Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it," said Alice angrily. "It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited," said the March Hare. "I didn't know it was your table," said Alice. "It's laid for a great many more than 3. "Your hair needs cutting," said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech. "You should learn not to make personal remarks," Alice said with some severity. "It's very rude." The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" "Come, we shall have some fun now," thought Alice. "I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess what," she added aloud. "Do you mean that you think you can find out the answer to it?" said the March Hare. "Exactly so," said Alice. "Then you should say what you mean," the March Hare went on. "I do," Alice hastily replied. At least I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know." "Not the same thing a bit," said the Hatter. "You might as well as say that I see what I eat is the same as I eat what I see." "And you might as well say," said the March Hare, "that I like what I get is the same as I get what I like." "And you might as well say," added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking in his sleep, "that I breathe when I sleep, is the same as I sleep when I breathe." "That is the same thing with you," said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence.
"What day of the month is it?"
he said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then and holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little and then said, "The 4th."
"2 days wrong,"
sighed the Hatter.
"I told you shouldn't put butter in it. Butter wouldn't suit the works,"
he added, looking angrily at the March Hare.
"It was the best butter,"
the March Hare meekly replied.
"Yes, but some crumbs must have got in it as well,"
the Hatter grumbled.
"You shouldn't have put it in with a bread knife."
The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea and looked at it again. But he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark.
"It was the best butter, you know."
Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. "What a funny watch," she remarked. "It tells the day of the month, but doesn't tell what o'clock it is."
"Why should it?"
muttered the Hatter.
"Does your watch tell you what year it is?"
"Of course not," Alice replied very readily. "But that's because it says the same year for... It stays the same year for such a long time altogether."
"Which is just the case with mine,"
said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. "I don't quite understand you," she said, as politely as she could.
"The dormouse is asleep again,"
said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea upon its nose. The Dormouse shook its head impatiently and said, without opening its eyes, Of course, just what I was going to remark myself."
"Have you guessed the riddle yet?"
the Hatter said, turning to Alice again. "No, I give it up," Alice replied. "What's the answer?"
"I haven't the slightest idea," said the Hatter.
"Nor I," said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. "I think you might do something better with the time," she said, "than waste it in asking riddles that have no answers."
"If you do time as well as I do," said the Hatter, "you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him."
"I don't know what you mean," said Alice.
"Of course you don't,"
the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously.
"I dare you've never spoken to time."
"Perhaps not," Alice cautiously replied, "but I know I have beat time when I learn music."
"Aha! That accounts for it," said the Hatter. He won't stand beating. Now, if you only kept on good terms with him, he'd do almost anything you liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner. "I only wish it was," the March Hare said to itself in a whisper.
"That would be grand, certainly," said Alice thoughtfully. "But then, I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know."
"Not perhaps at first,"
said the Hatter.
"but you could keep it at 1:30 as long as you liked."
"Is that the way you manage it?" asked Alice. The Hatter shook his head mournfully.
"Not I. We quarreled last March, just before he went mad, you know,"
pointing his teaspoon at the March Hare.
"It was at the great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing, 'Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, How I wonder where you're at. You know the song, perhaps?
I've heard something like it, said Alice.
It goes on, in this way. Up above the world you fly, like a tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle.
Here the dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep.
Twinkle, 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 twinkle.
And went on so long that they had to pinch it to make it stop.
Well, I've hardly finished the first verse, said the Hatter, when the Queen jumped up and bawled out, he's murdering the time off with his head.
How dreadfully savage, exclaimed Alice.
And ever since then,
the Hatter went on in a mournful tone,
he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now.
A bright idea came into Alice's head. Is that the reason for so many tea things that are put out here?
Yes, that's it,
said the Hatter with a sigh.
It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things between times.
Then you keep moving around, I suppose, said Alice.
Exactly so, said the Hatter, as the things get used up.
So what happens when you come to the beginning again? Alice ventured to ask.
Suppose we change the subject,
the March Hare interrupted, yawning.
I'm getting very tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story.
I'm afraid I don't know one, said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal. The Dormouse shall, then, they both cried.
Wake up, Dormouse!
And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes.
I wasn't asleep, he said in a hoarse, feeble voice. I heard every word you fellows were saying. Tell us a story,
said the March Hare. Yes, please do, pleaded Alice.
And be quick about it,
added the Hatter,
or you'll be asleep again before it's done. Once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters,
the Dormouse began in a great hurry.
And their names were Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of a well.
What did they live on? Said Alice, who always took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking.
Well, they lived on treacle,
said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two. They couldn't have done that, you know, Alice gently remarked. They'd have been ill.
So they were,
said the Dormouse.
Very ill.
Treacle, by the way, is a type of syrup. Alice tried to fancy to herself what such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much. So she went on. But why did they live at the bottom of a well?
Take more tea,
the March Hare said to Alice very earnestly. I've had nothing yet, Alice replied in an offended tone, so I can't take more.
You mean you can't take less, said the Hatter. It's very easy to take more than nothing.
Nobody asked your opinion, said Alice.
Who's making personal remarks now?
The Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice did not quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea and bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question. Why did they live at the bottom of the well?
The Dormouse took a minute or two to think about it, and then said, it was a treacle well.
Oh, there's no such thing. Alice was beginning to get very angry. But the Hatter and the March Hare went, shh, shh. And the Dormouse sulkily remarked,
if you can't be civil, you'd better finish the story for yourself.
No, no, please go on, Alice said very humbly. I won't interrupt again. I dare say there may be a treacle well.
What indeed?
Said the Dormouse indignantly. However, he consented to go on.
And so these three little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know.
What did they draw? Said Alice, quite forgetting her promise.
Treacle,
said the Dormouse, without considering at all this time.
I want a clean cup, interrupted the Hatter. Let's all move one place odd.
He moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice rather unwillingly took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug into his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously. But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from?
You could draw water out of a water well,
said the Hatter. So don't you think you could draw a treacle out of a treacle well, eh? But they were in the well, Alice said to the Dormouse, not choosing to notice the last remark. Of course they were, said the Dormouse.
Well in.
This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting.
They were learning to draw,
the Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing his eyes, for it was getting very sleepy.
And they drew all manner of things. Oh, things beginning with M.
Why with an M? Said Alice.
Why not?
Said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse had closed its eyes by this time and was going off into a doze, but on being pinched by the Hatter, it woke up again with a little shriek and went on.
Everything that begins with M, such as mousetraps and the moon and memory, oh, and muchness. You know, you say things are much of muchness. Did you ever see such a thing as a drawing of muchness?
Really? Now you ask me, said Alice, very much confused. I don't think...
Then you shouldn't talk,
said the Hatter. Well, this last piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping that they would call after her. The last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot. At any rate, I'll never go there again, said Alice as she picked her way through the wood. It's the stupidest party I ever was at in all my life. Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it. That's very curious, she thought. But everything's curious today. I think I might as well go in at once. And she went in. Once more, she found herself in the long hall, and close to the little glass table. Now, I'll manage it this time, she said to herself, and began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she went on work nibbling at the mushroom. She had kept a piece of it in her pocket till she was about a foot high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. And that's chapter 7. The Mad Tea Party. Oh, they are a little wild, those folks. We got one more, I think. That's about 9:20. Would you like one more? Perhaps. I think I want to read one more. Okay, chapter 8, the last one for the evening. This is called The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, hastily painting them red. Alice thought this a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them. And just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say, "Look out, Five, don't go splashing paint over me like that." "I couldn't help it," said Five in a sulky tone. "Seven jogged my elbow." On which Seven looked up and said, "Oh, that's right, Five. Always lay the blame on others." "You're one to talk," said Five. "I heard the Queen say only yesterday you deserve to be beheaded." "What for?" said the one who had spoken first. "That's none of your business, Two," said Seven. "Yes, it is his business," said Five, "and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions." Seven flung down his brush, and had just begun with, "Well, of all the unjust Alice," as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked round also, and all of them bowed low. "Would you tell me," said Alice, a little timidly, "why you are painting those roses?" 5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice, "Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, and we put a white one in by mistake, and if the Queen was to find out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So, you see, miss, we're doing our best before she comes to—" At this moment, 5, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out, "The Queen! The Queen!" And the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat on their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers, carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds, and walked 2 and 2, as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along hand in hand in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the White Rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion. And, last of all, this grand procession came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not to lie down on her face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions. And besides, what would be the use of a procession, thought she, if people had all to lie down upon their faces, so that they couldn't see it? So she stood where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely, "Who is this?" She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply. "Idiot," said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice, she went on, "What is your name, child?" "My name is Alice, so please your Majesty," said Alice very politely, but she added to herself, "Why, They're only a pack of cards, after all. I needn't be afraid of them. And who are these? Said the Queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners who were lying round the rose tree. For you see, as they were lying on their faces and the pattern on their backs was the same as the rest of the pack, she could not tell whether they were gardeners, or soldiers, or courtiers, or 3 of her own children. How should I know? Said Alice, surprised at her own courage. It's no business of mine. The Queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, screamed, "Off with her head! Off!" "Nonsense," said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said, "Consider, my dear, she is only a child." The Queen turned angrily away from him and said to the knave, "Turn them over." The knave did so very carefully with 1 foot. "Get up," said the Queen, in a shrill, loud voice, and the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King and the Queen and the royal children and everybody else. "Leave off that!" screamed the Queen. "You make me giddy." And then turning to the rose tree, she went on, "What have you been doing here?" "May it please your Majesty," said Tu, in a very humble tone, going down on 1 knee as he spoke, "we were trying—" "I see," said the Queen, who had, meanwhile, been examining the roses. "Off with their heads!" And the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners who ran to Alice for protection. "You shan't be beheaded," said Alice, and she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or 2, looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the Queen. "Their heads are gone, if it please your Majesty," the soldiers shouted in reply. "That's right," shouted the Queen. "Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her. "Why, yes," said Alice. "Come on, then!" roared the Queen, and Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next. It's a very fine day," said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the White Rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Hush, hush," said the rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered, "She's under sentence for execution." "For what?" said Alice. "Did you say, 'what a pity'?" the rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," said Alice. "I don't think it's at all a pity. I said, 'for what?'" "She boxed the Queen's ears," the rabbit began. Alice gave a little scream of laughter. "Oh, hush!" the rabbit whispered in a frightened tone. "The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the Queen said—" "Get to your places!" shouted the Queen in a voice of thunder. And people began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or 2, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The balls were live hedgehogs, the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and to stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She succeeded in getting its body tucked away comfortably enough under her arm with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as she had got its neck nicely straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, the flamingo would twist itself around and look up in her face, with such a puzzled expression that she could not help bursting out laughing. And when she had got its head down and was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or furrow in the way wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to, and as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once, without waiting for turns, quarreling all the while and fighting for the hedgehogs. And in a very short time the queen was in a furious passion, and went stamping about and shouting, "Off with his head!" or "Off with her head!" about once in a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy. To be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute with the queen, but she knew that it might happen any minute. And then, thought she, what would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive. She was looking about for some way to escape, and wondering whether she could get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but, watching it a minute or two, she made out that it was a grin, and she said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have someone to talk to." "How are you getting on?" said the cat, as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared, and then nodded. It's no use speaking to it, she thought, till its ears have come about, or at least one of them. In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it now in sight, and no more needed to appear. "I don't think they play at all fairly," Alice began, in a rather complaining tone, "and they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak, and they don't seem to have any rules in particular. At least, if there are, nobody attends to them, and you've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through next, walking about at the other end of the ground. And I should have croqueted the queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming." "How do you like the queen?" said the cat, in a low voice. "Not at all," said Alice. "She's so extremely—" Just then she noticed that the queen was close behind her, listening. So she went on, "Likely to win, and it's hardly worth while finishing the game." The queen smiled and passed on. "Who are you talking to?" said the king, going up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity. "It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire Cat," said Alice. "Allow me to introduce it."
"I don't like the look of it at all,"
said the king.
"However, it may kiss my hand if it likes."
"I'd rather not," the cat remarked.
"Don't be impertinent," said the king, "and don't look at me like that." He got behind Alice as he spoke.
"A cat may look at a king," said Alice. "I've read that in some book, but I don't remember where."
"Well, it must be resolved,"
said the king very decidedly, and he called the queen, who was passing at the moment.
"My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed." The queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small. "Off with his head," she said, without even looking round. "I'll fetch the executioner myself," the king said eagerly, and he hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on, as she heard the queen's voice in the distance, screaming with passion. She had already heard her sentence 3 of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she did not like the look of things at all, as the game was in such confusion that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for coquetting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across to the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it trying in a helpless sort of way to fly up into a tree. By the time she had caught the flamingo and brought it back, the fight was over, and both hedgehogs were out of sight. But it doesn't matter much, thought Alice, as the arches are gone from this side of the ground. So she tucked the flamingo away under her arm, that it might not escape again, and went back for a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected round it. There was a dispute going on between the executioner, the king, and the queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were quite silent and looked very uncomfortable. The moment Alice appeared, she was appealed to by all 3 to settle the question, and they repeated their arguments to her, though as they all spoke at once, and she found it very hard indeed to make out exactly what it was they said. The executioner's argument was that you couldn't cut off a head unless there was a body to cut it off from, that he had never had to do such a thing before, and he wasn't going to begin at his time of life. The king's argument was that anything that had a head could be beheaded, and that you weren't to talk nonsense. The queen's argument was that if something wasn't done about it in less than no time, she'd have everybody beheaded all round. It was this remark that had made the whole party look so grave and anxious. Alice could think of nothing else to say but, "It belongs to the Duchess. You'd better ask her about it." "She's in prison," said the queen to the executioner. "Fetch her here." And the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and by the time he had come back with the Duchess, it had entirely disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game. I told you, a very weird game of croquet. Flamingos and hedgehogs and living arches, not to mention the tea party. Well, my friend, that does it for this evening's Aurora Bedtime Story. I'm Chris Voss. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked that and you want to hear some different stories sometime, let me know in the comments. Leave some comments down below and tell me what you'd like me to read next, and I'll happily do so. We're 8 chapters through Alice in Wonderland. We've got 4 to go, and then we'll be done with the book. So in 2 days, if we do 2 more chapters, we'll be done with the book. Tomorrow will be the last reading for the week, and then we'll start up again on Sunday. And with that, I want to take another nice deep breath. And from my little nook here in the canopy room to yours, wish you a very good night.